Oh God, you made us in your own image and redeemed us through your Son, Jesus. Look with compassion on the whole human family. Take away the arrogance and hatred which infect our hearts. Break down the walls that separate us. Unite us in bonds of love and work through our struggle and confusion to accomplish your purposes on earth. That in your good time all nations and races may serve you in harmony around your heavenly throne. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Good morning. It's good to see all of you. Welcome. And I'm delighted that our forum resumes this fall with an incredible topic and a wonderful speaker who many of us know. But more about that in a minute. I want to start with a very brief story about something that occurred in our life, Catherine's and my life, it was either the fall of 2001 or the spring of 2002. I can't exactly remember. And we had just moved home, or back to Alabama, from New York and from seminary. And we were in the middle of all that transition, sort of figuring out our place in the community. And Catherine, my wife, went to what was billed as a community Bible study. And it was taught by someone. It was a women's Bible study taught by a female. And it was who belonged to what's called a non-denominational church. And actually, I'm almost certain that the church was First Bible in Decatur, Alabama. And they were marching through the book of Genesis, as you sometimes do. And they had made it to chapter 9. This was Catherine's initial Bible study. And the person made it to chapter 9, and the Bible story in chapter 9 is the curse, Noah's curse of Ham, one of his sons. And Ham does something terrible and is cursed by Noah. And by extension, Noah really curses not Ham, but Canaan, his grandson. And the text says something like this in Genesis 9, that Noah said to Canaan, "You will be a servant unto servants forever." And as my wife Catherine was sitting there, the Bible study leader said, that explains why African Americans, I think she said black people, are always in the servant role. Canaan is the origin of the African American race. It's a classic example of what's sometimes called eisegesis, reading something into a text that's not actually there, rather than interpreting something out of a text. Now, eisegesis, reading into a text, is not always a bad thing. That's precisely what we love about artists who interpret Scripture, whether through paint or word. They interpret and see something literally in color and perspective that might not be there, but helps to open our eyes and imagination to see in a different way, even if literally what they are showing us in color or in portrayal is not literally there. It can open our eyes to understand the biblical text in a more profound way. So eisegesis is not always bad, but in this case, it's a sheer tragedy. It's just wrong on every level that Canaan is the ancestor of African Americans, and that curse of Canaan is what has explained the relationship between the races ever since. It's a demanding, difficult, and essential question to ask for all kinds of reasons. Where the word and term race comes from, why we see it when we see it, what our motives are, and what has shaped our imagination in all of these moments when we think about race. And I cannot tell you how excited I am to struggle with that question with Dr. Stephen Haynes. Dr. Haynes is a great friend of Grace St. Luke's. He's a child who in our school, and has taught at the Rector's Forum a number of times. He's taught at Rhodes since 1989. He's the author of a number of books, including The Last Segregated Hour, the Memphis Kneel-Ins, and also a great title, Bonhoeffer for Armchair Theologians. Well-published, gifted teacher. Please welcome him warmly back to Grace St. Luke's.
Thank you much. Yeah, thanks, Richard. So the story that Richard told is actually a perfect lead-in to what I want to do today, because I've been asked to talk about the Bible and race, which is, it seems like every topic that you all ask me to do is impossible to really get one's head around. This is no different. But I decided to talk about Genesis as a way of getting into this question of how race has historically been read into the Bible. Because my argument is going to be, and I think this is scholars of the Old Testament, of the Hebrew Bible would agree, race doesn't really come into play in the Hebrew Bible. There's no concept of race the way we think of it in the modern world. And so the question, how do texts get read in racial ways, says a lot more about us and our way of thinking than it does about the people in the Bible. So I'm going to start with Genesis 1, and I'm going to focus today on Genesis 1 through 11, the first 11 chapters of Genesis, which are sometimes referred to as the primeval history. They're the history of humankind before Abraham, before things got specific with one family. Up till then, everything was talking about sort of a family that was universal in significance. So I'm going to also ask those of you who feel like you want to read, because I like to do this in class, like have people read what we're looking at. I think it makes the text more accessible for all of us. Will somebody read? You might recognize this from Genesis 1. Will somebody read this first part? Thanks, Kurt.
Then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created humankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them.
Thank you. Very nice. So this is Genesis 1, and you'll notice there's some distinctions here between the creatures that precede the creation of humankind and then human beings. And you also notice something interesting, and I don't want to go down this road because it's a different topic, but there's no distinction at all between men and women in this chapter. Certainly no hierarchical relationship. And the hierarchy that Christians and Jews often see in the Bible comes from chapters 2 and 3, which have a different understanding of Eve's relationship to Adam. At any rate, so we have creation, and as I tell my students, within 10 minutes, things go terribly wrong, right? You have the first couple in the garden, and God says to them, life's going to be great. Oh, by the way, there's just one thing you can't do. And literally, within a few sentences, this is the thing that they do. They blame each other. The result is they get kicked out of the garden. They suddenly realize that they're naked, they're ashamed. So you have sin, defiance, shame all enter into the world at the same time. And then they are cast out of the garden, and they have a family, and within 10 more minutes, one son has killed the other son. And the narrator in Genesis says basically, violence has gotten so bad that God decides to start over. So this is chapter 6, right? We're just 5 chapters past creation. Somebody read where we are with chapter 6, verses 11 and following.
Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on earth had corrupted their ways. So God said to Noah, "I'm going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I am surely going to destroy both them and the earth."
So this is a pretty surprising turn, given the fact that just a few chapters before, God is talking about how good things are, how good the creation is, how pleasing it is. So, but there's going to be a remnant that survives. This is the family of Noah. And this is later in chapter 6. Somebody read this passage.
"But I will establish my covenant with you, and you will enter the ark, you and your sons and your wives and your sons' wives with you. You are to bring into the ark 2 of all living creatures, male and female, to keep them alive with you. 2 of every kind of bird, of every kind of animal, and of every kind of creature that moves along the ground and will come to you to be kept alive."
Thank you. So part of creation is going to be preserved, the non-thinking part. And then there's going to be a little remnant of the human part that's going to be preserved. It's basically going to be Noah's family. How many people survived the flood? A little trivia question. 8. How did you get 8?
Well, Shem, Ham, Japheth, Noah and his wife, and Shem, Ham, and Japheth's wives.
So Noah, his wife, Noah's 3 sons and their wives. Those are the 8 that survived the flood along with all the animals. This is an important thing because if you think of it logically, and if you take the Bible, this part of the Bible as having historicity, that is being historically accurate, we're all descendants of Noah, every one of us. There's nobody on earth who's not a descendant of Noah. So any distinctions within the human family have to come from Noah's family, right? And in a sense, they have to come from Noah's 3 sons. So this is important for where we're headed. So they go into the ark. The Lord shut them in. Nice little touch. I like this. The Lord kind of reaches down and shuts the door. And what we have in Genesis 9 in the beginning is basically a recreation, a starting over. Somebody read this section of Genesis 9, please.
And God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. The fear and dread of you will fall on all the beasts of the earth and on all the birds in the sky, on every creature that moves along the ground and all the fish in the sea. They are given into your hands. Everything that lives and moves about will be food for you. Just as I gave you the green plants, I now give you everything."
Thank you. So this is recreation, right? This is a very familiar line. I wasn't supposed to do that. I wasn't supposed to turn without turning my whole body. So this is a very familiar line. Be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth, right? Goes back to Genesis 1. The idea of dominion goes back. So this is a new start. So we're going to see, how do things go in this new start? Not even 5 minutes later, actually, in this case, things kind of fall apart. By the way, is there anybody who can get me a glass of water or a cup of water? Thanks, Harriet. And just to sort of seal this promise that God makes to the survivors of the flood, he has a nice little sign that he sets up. Somebody read this passage, please.
And God said, "This is the sign of the covenant I am making between me and you and every living creature with you, a covenant for all generations to come. I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Whenever I bring clouds over the earth and the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will remember my covenant between me and you and all living creatures of every kind."
Thank you. That was beautiful. That was very well done. And I appreciate your willingness to participate in this by reading. So things are back to a really steady state, right? God has recreated the world, made some promises, and actually promised not to destroy everything again, even if sin re-enters the world. Thank you, Jeff. So we're on a much more feeling confident that things are going to go well. Well, within a few verses, we have this story, which is actually the story that Richard referred to in his intro. And I'll read this one because I want to pause it in a couple places. So the sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Right? These are the 3 sons that are mentioned before the flood. These were the 3 sons of Noah who from them came the people who were scattered over the whole earth, right? So clean start, no more people. Everybody at this point is a descendant of Noah. Noah, a man of the soil, proceeded to plant a vineyard. When he drank some of its wine, he became drunk and lay uncovered inside his tent. So drunk and naked is the paraphrase, right? Passed out, drunk and naked. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father naked and told his 2 brothers outside, but Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it across their shoulders. Then they walked in backward and covered their father's naked body. Their faces were turned the other way so that they would not see their father naked. You with us so far? What's happened?
Ham's bad, the other 2 are good.
Well, it's not clear whether it's Ham or Canaan, really, right? There's what scholars call slippage in this text. Because you've got Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the father, so far it's Ham, and the curse is going to be on Canaan, so that's where the slippage is in the second part of this text. So you've got a novice in viticulture, drinks a little bit too much wine, passes out, and somehow it says, so he passes out, they walk in backwards. 2 of the brothers are very respectful. Ham is not so respectful. He tells his brothers what's going on. He sort of broadcasts it. When Noah awoke from his wine and found out what his youngest son had done to him, and this is a very tantalizing verse because it suggests, and it's always suggested to readers, that there was some kind of physical assault on Noah. Otherwise, how does he know what's done to him when he awakes from this drunken stupor unless there's been some sort of sign of assault. He said, "Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves will he be to his brothers." He also said, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Shem. May Canaan be the slave of Shem. May God extend Japheth's territory. May Japheth live in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be the slave of Japheth." So basically we have Canaan kind of standing in for Ham here, Canaan being one of the 4 sons of Ham, being cursed to slavery, sort of perpetually, slavery to his brothers, obviously, though those are the only people who are around. And this is a very interesting passage, which scholars would say has a lot to do with the Israelites' relationship to the Canaanites and the habit that the Israelites were in had of making fun of the Canaanites and sort of demeaning them at every opportunity. And one of the things that Israelites thought about the Canaanites was that they had really weird sexual practices that were involved in their religious sort of practices, and they would constantly kind of imply that the Canaanites are perverts. So this is one sort of way of doing that. But if you take this part of the Bible believe it's historical, that is, that it's an accurate depiction of what happened after the flood, you've got a really nice description of the various destinies of the 3 sons of Noah, if that's what you're looking for. So if you want to think about the relative destinies of Japhethites, who are in Genesis 10 described as people who sort of migrate in the direction of Europe, Semites who migrate in the other direction, and Hamites who migrate south, if you want to think about the relationship of those groups, you have a nice way of doing that. And that this is going to be very fateful for interpretation of the 19th century when it comes time to defend slavery. So Genesis 10, which I'm guessing you've never read, because even if you're reading Genesis, it's sort of hard to get through this because it's a list of names, most of which you can't pronounce. And it's called the Table of Nations. It's the descendants of Noah through his 3 sons, taking us up to Abraham, basically. It's a link. It's a way to link Noah and subsequent generations. So we have 3 groups. We have the Japhethites. From these, the maritime people spread out into their territories by their clans with their nations, each with its own language, which is interesting because in chapter 11 they're all going to suddenly have a different language, but at any rate. We've got the Hamites, 4 sons, Cush, Egypt, Put, and Canaan, all sort of representing southern nations. And then there's this little passage in Genesis 10 that even if you were interested in reading Genesis 10, you might not find. Very, very kind of short and provocative text about a guy named Nimrod. And this is how it goes. Cush was the father of Nimrod, who became a mighty warrior on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. That's why it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The first centers of his kingdom were Babylon, Uruk, Akkad, and Calneh, and Shinar. These are the sons of Ham by their clans and languages and their territories and nations. And this reference to Babylon is going to be crucial for Nimrod, because in chapter 11, we've got the story of the Tower of Babel. And so here we have basically a character without a story in chapter 10. And in chapter 11, we've got a story without a main character. Who was the builder of the Tower of Babel? Traditionally, it's thought that Nimrod was involved in that. And you'll see why this is important in a minute. Semites are listed. And the last thing in chapter 10 is this reference to kind of a rehashing of what's happened in this chapter. These are the clans of Noah's sons, according to their lines of descent, within their nations. From these, the nations spread out over the earth after the flood. There's nothing about race to this point. What we have is the idea of nations that are descended from what are called eponymous ancestors. That is, people whose names represent the character of their descendants. So you have Cushites, who are descendants of Cush. You have Japhethites of various kinds, who are descendants of Japheth. Are they different? Well, they speak different languages, apparently, and they've spread out over the world. And certainly the ancient Israelites knew that people looked different. There was some variation in human appearance. But there's nothing like the concept of race yet in the Bible. And I would argue there never is, but certainly to this point. So then we've got this interesting story of the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11. And to this point, we have distinction between people. And now we have dispersion, not just as a sort of fact of life, but as something that's insisted upon by God. God wants people to be dispersed across the earth. Somebody read this section of Genesis 11, please.
Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as they migrated from the east, they came upon a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise we shall be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth."
Thank you. So these people want to build a tower to heaven, basically, and they want to do it so they won't be scattered. And the thought is perhaps they're concerned with another flood, that this will be sort of, will provide safety for that. Would you finish the last little part?
The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which mortals had built. And the Lord said, "Look, they are one people, and they have all one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language there, so that they will not understand one another's speech."
You're doing great. Will you do one more? I forgot there was
So the
more.
Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth.
Thank you so much. It's over, that story. So here we have a really interesting story. Scholars call these etiologies, that is, stories that explain something, explain the origins of something. This is a great story to explain why it is that people speak different languages. You can imagine somebody, a kid asking their parent, why do we all speak different languages? Let me tell you a story, right? This is the story to tell. This is one explanation. But there's something in the text that I think is we need to look at, and that is this idea of dispersion, which is going to become an important theme in biblical interpretation as time goes on. And when you add that to distinction, even though we don't have racial distinction yet, we have distinction between the sons of Noah. These are the elements that are going to contribute to a racialized reading of the Bible that we find, I was going to say in the 19th century, but we, according to Richard, also in the 21st century in Alabama. And by the way, this is the week when we get to feel smug about other people, so enjoy it. Next week we're going to be talking about white privilege, right, which hits us in a little different way, more directly. And then the third week, Richard and I are going to have a conversation about this parish, its history, its future, around, have I got that right? Okay. So this is the week we get to sort of sit back and think, these people are so gullible. Okay. So how does race get read into these stories? How does this happen? So here's a shorthand list, little bullet points, which I think are all the things that I think we need to consider. One is assumptions of the Bible's historicity. Particularly up until the 19th century, people assumed that the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, Genesis, the primeval history, presented a reliable account of how human beings came in to be the way we are. You may remember Bishop Ussher, who was the guy in 17th century Britain who tried to give a timeline of the Bible from creation all the way down, and the assumption there is that it's a reliable history, not just a collection of stories, but history of how things came to be. Another issue is encounters during the age of exploration. Europeans start to travel all over the world. They start to encounter people who look very different than them. And they start to think about how to explain this. Maybe there are different types of people. People are fundamentally different. Maybe they're all not results of creation and Genesis. Maybe there's something called polygenesis, different origins for different groups of people. We have this obsession in the modern age with classification. So the way that you want to classify insects and animals and various species and types and so forth, a lot of scientists want to classify human beings as well. And so we'll see how this works. Philology, the study of languages, I'm not sure I'm even going to talk about this because it may be more complicated than it's worth, but basically the idea is that people began to realize that languages fell into certain families. You have Indo-European languages, Semitic languages, and other languages, and this inference was made that if you had people who spoke the same kind of language, they must be of the same race. And so race was sort of inferred into observations about language. And finally, this is maybe the most important one, the need to justify racial slavery. So it's a little bit of a chicken and an egg question, which comes first, racism or slavery, but certainly racism as we've come to know it is a product largely of justification of racial slavery that was already a phenomenon that needed some biblical sanction. And what we have in the Bible is lots of references to slavery. That's not the problem. If you're looking for references to slavery in the Old Testament, there are dozens. The problem is combining that with race. And there's nowhere in the Bible that does that unless you read Genesis 9 very, very cleverly. So this is a picture. That's why I said you needed to move forward, because you probably can't see this very well. But in case you were wondering, creation occurred in 4004 BC. I think at 9 o'clock in the morning. Is that right? I mean, Bishop, this wasn't really intended to be a joke. He actually, in October. So we're coming up on the anniversary. And so from this, he sets down all the different the dates when these people were born. So Noah, 2948 BC, Shem born 2446, and so forth. So the idea is that these stories allow us to locate in real history what was happening when the flood was, when these other things occurred. We also have, as I mentioned, the age of exploration, right? This is a picture of Columbus encountering Native Americans, and this is just one of many examples we could give. There's many stories of Europeans traveling to Africa and encountering black Africans for the first time, and just it leading to a lot of questions. How do we explain this? These people don't look like us. I talked about the rage for classification. So one way to think about this is just in a descriptive mode, right? So you describe the various types of people. So here's a nice little collage of the various sorts of people that by the 19th century had been discovered around the world. And you could argue that there's no hierarchy here. It's just simply, although the Europeans do tend to be in the middle, there's nothing derogatory intended. It's just kind of a celebration of, the diversity that is the world. But almost inevitably, you get this hierarchy, this idea that certain kinds of facial features, certain kinds of cranial dimensions are more advanced, and other kinds are closer to the animals and so forth. So social Darwinism becomes, in the 19th century, a way of classifying, which obviously is Eurocentric and is ultimately going to be very dangerous for people, non-Europeans. But this is one of the factors that leads to racial reading of the Bible. This is talk about language. I'm going to skip that because, as I said, I'm not sure it's worth getting into. But the slave trade clearly makes it necessary to understand differences of race and to understand them in a way that allows for hierarchy and control and superiority. And in this sense, Genesis 9 is perfect for the task, because it seems to set up a hierarchy between the sons of Noah, which, according to some readings, is to be kept maintained in perpetuity. So I mentioned slavery in the Bible, so we could start with Abraham. It was clear that Abraham was a wealthy man, and the way wealth was signified in those days was partly by the number of wives you had, number of livestock you had, but also the number of slaves you had. And so there are lots of references to Abraham's slaves and other of the patriarchs as well. So that the pro-slavery argument, now we're in the 19th century in America, at a time in the South when people were vociferously arguing for the biblical justification of slavery. Abraham has a large role in this, right? So lots of stuff about his slaves, about property lists, about receiving slaves as gifts, and so forth. Not so important except that you just see that slavery is there. That's not the problem. It's also in Leviticus and other places. And then we get to the New Testament, and this was perhaps even more damning in the 19th century for people who are arguing against slavery. The New Testament seems to suggest that whatever happens to one when one becomes a Christian, it doesn't really affect your station in life in terms of whether you're slave or free. Now, this isn't entirely true, because the book of Philemon can be read to cast a very different light on this, but there are several places in the New Testament that suggest that Jesus, the apostles, didn't have any problem with slavery. They wanted you to be good slaves, and they wanted your slave masters to be good slave masters, but they didn't. This wasn't a disordering of society that was intended. So, getting back to this idea of the three sons of Noah being the the ancestors of all of us. So when people made maps back then, they were less helpful than they are today, but they were more symmetrical. So this is a map, I can't remember exactly when this is from, sometime in the late Middle Ages, of Europe, Asia, and Africa. And the fact that there were 3 continents, understood to be sort of 3 connecting continents, fit perfectly with the story of Noah and his sons, right? 3 sons. So you've got Ham going south, you've got Shem going east, and you've got Japheth going west. You've got some outliers like England and Greenland and so forth. And so then you have maps like this a little later, which a little more sophisticated kind of view of the world, but you have the 3 sons of Noah holding up the map. There's Japheth over in that. Oh, there he is. Japheth over there, there's Shem over there, and Ham down here, so generally in the direction of Africa. So this tripartite division of humanity works really well in this sort of medieval European understanding of the way the world is divided up. So now let's talk about the story of Noah and his sons in Genesis 9, because it's a story that has really intrigued readers. What happened to Noah? What happened? Something happened that was severe enough for him to wake up and in a state of something, a state of great anger, curse his son/grandson to be slave of his other 2 sons. So, and there's something about him being uncovered, so maybe it was some kind of sexual thing. We don't know. There are lots of ways to paint, to depict this scene, and typically we have the 3 sons of Noah being depicted as almost identical, right? And this is true for a long time. It's hard to tell any difference, right? It would be hard to argue that these 3 people ended up being the progenitors of races that look different, right? That starts to change a little bit. In this case, again from the late Middle Ages, you've got Noah, you've got Japheth and Shem, who are acting with filial responsibility. You've got Ham, who's pointing a finger. There's a little indication that these folks look a little different. The same here, although it's hard to say that this is racism. But we get to the 19th century, we have a full-blown racist depiction of Noah's family, to the point where it's absolutely ridiculous. But it really captures this desire to see in Noah's family the beginnings of race. This is from a book by a guy named Josiah Priest, who was a pro-slavery writer in the 19th century, a book called Slavery as It Relates to the African or Negro People. And he's got these wonderful, for historical reasons, depictions. So this is Noah here, right? He's the father. He set up an altar. There's his wife. You've got Japheth, the one who looks like Abraham Lincoln, sort of, right? Can you tell he's white? The Jesus-looking dude is Shem. And then this is Ham, who looks vaguely African. So this was Priest's way of indicating that if you take Genesis seriously, and if you take seriously the curse of Noah, you have to conclude that the 3 sons were progenitors of 3 entirely different races of people, and that they had different destinies. You with me? Really? Really? Okay.
I noticed that Shem is the progenitor of the red nations.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
does that mean that the Indians were Jews?
It means that the Indians were Semites. It's not quite the same, but basically, yes.
This doesn't go with they were the lost tribes.
Not really, but everybody has to fit into one of these 3 categories, right? So there are not a lot of opportunity, not a lot of options. So the third race is sometimes called red, sometimes called yellow. It becomes sort of this middle place, to set people who don't fit white or black. But it's a really interesting question, which I'm tempted to get into more, but I'm going to resist that temptation at the moment. Really interesting question about Native Americans. What do they represent? how do they fit into this prophecy? So this is a reading from somebody named Benjamin Palmer you may not have heard of, but he's important to me because he's one of the founders of Rhodes College. He's the guy whose name is on the main building at Rhodes, Palmer Hall. Palmer was a lot of things, but one of the things he was a very articulate and passionate advocate of slavery. And he was one of the people who used Genesis 9 to argue for slavery and who saw race in this passage. So somebody who's willing, read this section of this talk he gave in 1858 called Our Historic Mission.
The race of Shem was providentially selected as the channel for transmitting religion and worship. Japheth and his race seemed designated to be the organ of human civilization, cultivating the intellectual powers. Japhetic whites, spreading over the diversified continent of Europe through a protracted discipline, developed the higher powers of the soul in politics, jurisprudence, science, and art, while the Asiatic Japhethites dispersed over a more monotonous continent, embark in those pursuits of industry fitted to the lower capacities of our nature. The descendants of Ham, on the contrary, in whom the sensual and corporeal appetites predominate, are driven like an infected race beyond the deserts of Sahara, where under a glowing sky, nature harmonizes with their brutal and savage disposition.
All that's in the Noah prophecy, right? That's basically what Noah was saying. That was a joke. He's obviously reading a great deal into this prophecy of Noah, right? That it basically defines the destinies of his three sons, that these three sons become the progenitors of these different races. He divides the Japhethites up a little bit to sort of, for his purposes, and some people did that. He was a remarkable speaker. One of the things that people say about Palmer is he's just a mesmerizing orator. And so it was probably easy for people maybe not to hear exactly what he was saying and just be impressed by the rhythm and the sound of his voice. But here it's pretty clear what he thinks about the different races. Basically, white people are supposed to be the organ of human civilization, right? They're supposed to be the ones who make laws and who develop cities and things like that. The Semites are the ones who get us in touch with God, and the Hamites are the ones who do all the work. And this was his theme really throughout the 1850s and 60s, and even past the time of the Civil War. And here's something he says really interesting in the same message. Let us say with all the distinctness and emphasis with which words of destiny are ever uttered, that we will conserve this institution of domestic servitude, slavery, not only from the pressure of necessity and from the instinct of interest, not only from a feeling of trusteeship over the race thus providentially committed to us, not even at last from a general conviction of the righteousness of our course, but also from a special sense of duty to mankind. This is the kind of thing Palmer said. He didn't want to be mistaken for someone who was just for slavery because he was a Southerner or because it was the law of his land. He wanted to make it clear that he was advocating it as correct, as legal, as right, as sort of God ordained. And this is interesting, this idea of trusteeship, the idea that, Japhethites are responsible for their brothers, for Hamites, because they're not able to really govern themselves. So there's a sense of kind of patriarchal noblesse oblige here. So Palmer's traveling around the South, and I choose Palmer as one example. Many people were saying the same thing about the same texts. But Palmer in 1860 gives a famous speech in New Orleans, which is where he was at the time, where he's arguing for secession, and one of the bases for that is this prophecy of Noah. Somebody read this paragraph, please.
From first to last, the physical and moral characteristics, together with the guidance of
Thank you, Dickie. One thing he doesn't say here, but that is clearly part of his argument, is that Ham represents Africans, right? He doesn't mention the connection. He's just assuming that we all accept it. Ham was pronounced a double of servitude and so forth, and he talks about Hamites as if everybody knows that they include the people enslaved in the American South. So you may have been wondering, since I mentioned Nimrod, where the heck he comes in this whole thing. It's very interesting because Bible readers in an earlier generation paid a lot of attention to details. And when they saw that Nimrod was associated with Babel and with Shinar, and that the next chapter has this tower built, they said, well, Nimrod must have been the builder. And it makes a kind of sense because Nimrod is the grandson of Ham through Cush. And so if anybody's going to be responsible for this act of defiance against God, it would be a Hamite, right? We all know about the Hamites. Noah already told us about them. They're not, they don't play by the rules, they're not respectful, they have to be sort of put in their place. And so Nimrod ultimately will become a Negro. He'll be racialized so that he can represent one part of the Negro character. So this is the way Nimrod was thought of when he wasn't racialized, as a giant who was, in Dante, he sort of babbles, he doesn't have the gift of language. This is the way Josiah Priest saw Nimrod. The mighty hunter, you notice he's sort of fighting wild animals. He's sort of barely human, really, and definitely has the hue of his grandfather Ham. This is the way Nimrod and the tower builders were depicted in the Middle Ages. You've got Nimrod, and he's sort of wrapped himself in a royal robe, but he's got people following him. His tower's been destroyed. This is the way in the 19th century a racialized Nimrod appeared. This is let's see, Tower of Babel, the House of Ham, Direction Nimrod, Japheth, the white man, is seen in front of the, yeah. So this is Japheth, the white man, who's instructing Ham, or Nimrod, the Hamite Nimrod, about the folly of building this tower and how it's destined for destruction. Do you see how race is read back into this story in a very powerful way? A race that wasn't in the Bible at all, but it becomes common sense to people, so that when they read these texts, they say, well, of course this has to do with slavery. Of course this has to do with the character of Hamites. What time do we have to quit? Is Richard still in here? Oh, we can keep going. Okay. So one of the things that Palmer does, and by the way, if you want to read Palmer's writings, they're still published by a certain kind of Presbyterian who believes that people like Palmer have things to say to us today. He's not that kind of Presbyterian. That's a whole nother category. He says, Palmer says, the sacred writings clearly teach that to prevent the amazing wickedness which brought upon the earth the purgation of the deluge, the flood, God saw fit to break the human family into sections. He separated them by destroying the unity of speech, then by actual dispersion, appointing the bounds of their habitation to which they were conducted by the mysterious guidance of his will. This is 1872. There's no slavery anymore. Palmer was very aware of that. All Southerners were. So the question now became, how do we arrange the connections between these peoples who live together in the South? In other words, how can we segregate them to make sure that we don't have these sort of amalgamation that we all fear? He went back to the same passages, set of passages in Genesis 9 through 11. These are passages that dealt with dispersion, with distinction, and what we have in the 1950s. How many? That's a two? 2 or 3. 2 or 3. Okay. That's perfect, because this is where I wanted to end. What we have in the 1950s is a reaching back to arguments like Palmer's to talk about the way segregation is a biblical value. We know it's biblical because it's what happened in Genesis 9 through 11. God was constantly making distinctions between people through Noah, constantly dispersing people. And so I won't bore you with all these details except to give you one that might be of interest. This is in the Constitution of Independent Presbyterian Church in Memphis, which was passed, accepted, voted on in 1965, and I have to say was later rescinded, this part of the Constitution. But it's very telling.